Hi there, Chris from TotallyEV, and here I'm going through a slightly different video. I'm going to go through the entire range of the DS fleet, at least at the time of filming and in the UK. There's a DS3, 4, 7 and 9. Now I'll be jumping as to somewhat of a lucky dip as to what I actually get into, but I'll be going through the entire range and giving you my initial impressions. So I've just got into the DS4. It is the Performance Line E-Tent 225. So first impressions, interior, it looks quite nice. It feels quite good. I love what they've done with the upholstery work towards the dashboard, and then there's some fancy buttons found towards the door panel. Obviously that's to do with the windows. So if we pop that down, yep, that's exactly what it does. So let's start up the engine. So this is a plug-in hybrid. It's telling me I've got 19 miles with 100% charge and 323 miles with a full tank of petrol. Of course, that'll depend on how you drive. Infotainment system looks pretty good. Towards the center console, there's actually a little bit of a small display, which looks quite fancy. And then you've got a drive mode selector and then B mode, which I quite like using. So I'm going to enable that. Now you've got different drive modes to select from. I've got electric, comfort, hybrid and sport. So we're going to go on the hybrid mode. So I'm just going to come back to you in a little bit after I've done a little bit of driving so I can give you my initial impressions of the DS4. So I've done a little bit of driving in the DS4 and I can safely say I'm quite impressed. Now right now I'm driving at roughly 14 miles an hour in pure EV mode, and if I put my foot down it goes into petrol mode. Now the transition between the two modes is absolutely seamless, and yes, over there via kickdown it won't exactly be as seamless as you might expect, but right now we just went from petrol mode to pure EV mode as I approached that 30 mile an hour zone, and of course you didn't feel it and I didn't hear it, so that is absolutely impressive to say the least. Now for me to actually tell to know which mode it's actually running on, I have to look towards my instrument cluster and at my head-up display. When it's in white, it's in petrol mode. When it's in blue, it's in EV mode. Now, in terms of the driver's feel, I do feel quite connected with the front axle. This is a front-wheel drive vehicle, if I'm not mistaken. And in this respect, I feel, well, when I'm twisting the steering wheel, the vehicle is responding pretty well. Now, of course, it won't compete with some sportier vehicles out there on the market, but in the grand scheme of things, I really do like the driver's feel of this vehicle. Furthermore, I feel quite planted down to the ground. I've got good vision in front of me where I can peer over my bonnet. The seats themselves feel soft but also quite accommodating as well. I feel quite gripped around when I was going around those country roads at 50 miles an hour. I didn't feel like I was seesawing about in the seat. And equally in terms of the visibility at the side and at the rear, it's absolutely excellent. It's very easy to check over my blind spot. My only complaint, however, is that the rear view mirror placement is at my 11 to 10 o'clock and therefore takes away some of my vision. So therefore when I'm going around a corner or for example a roundabout, I kind of have to duck over. It might not be a problem for everyone, but as someone who's 6 foot tall and likes to sit relatively high up, it's something I've noticed of most of these vehicles from the Stellantis group, and the DS is no different in this department. Now in terms of the comfort at the rear, it is a little bit limited due to the size of the vehicle. It's no surprise that headroom and legroom are indeed going to be one of the major issues, at least if you're going to be transporting larger or taller sized individuals. They might feel a little bit hemmed in. No problems whatsoever if you're taking, let's say, the children for your school run, then I don't think it's going to cause any problem. The boot as well is a little bit limited yet again due to the size of the vehicle, so that should not come as to any surprise. Now as for the interior tech, as I did mention before, quite impressed with the initial impressions, and in terms of interacting with it, it's actually very easy. You've got some physical buttons placed towards the dashboard, making it very easy to access certain settings, and as for the center console, it's not overdone. It still feels quite simple and yet intuitive to use, so I really like what DS have done. As for the exterior design, yet again, the car looks very stylish and snazzy. It certainly does stand out in comparison to its siblings, so for example the likes of Vauxhall, Opel or indeed Peugeot's offerings, but in this respect the DS looks a little bit more premium, and it's unsurprising given it does sit in terms of the more premium end of the market. So overall, the initial impressions of the DS4 are certainly positive, and I really can't wait to see what's in store in the next vehicle. Now the next vehicle is the DS9, and straight away I can tell this is the top of the line vehicle from the manufacturer, because the stitching work, the upholstery, and even there's a little analog clock that can be found on the dashboard, somewhat reminiscent of what you'd find in a Porsche. It just looks and feels absolutely exquisite. I'm not really sure about the burgundy finish, but I do think it will stand out in comparison to the rest of the crowd. Now in terms of the technology implementation, the instrument cluster is very vivid and provides all the key information, and as for the infotainment system, it's a little bit convoluted due to the fact that it's running on an older operating system. I've been told that this will be updated, so therefore will be in line with what we just experienced in the DS4. Now, as for the center console, it does feel a little bit over-engineered, but it does look the part, with physical buttons and the gear selector being positioned quite in a good place. Now, aside from that, in terms of the driving position, I've got a great sort of view in front of me where I can peer over the bonnet. Yet again, the rear view mirror is a little bit awkwardly placed. And as for the side view, it's absolutely excellent. It's very easy to peer over for my blind spot. So in order to the initial impressions, I must say I am very impressed. And I can also feel that this is a bit more of a serene interior. We'll find out soon. So I'm going to go on to some driving and get back to you with my initial driving impressions. Now, I've done a little bit of driving in the DS9 and I can really tell that suspension system is doing an absolutely excellent work. But the engine just feels a bit sluggish. See, with a DS4, it felt a little bit more appropriate, but with this car, it just feels a bit too slow. Now, if I were to put my foot down, the car does go, but you can really hear it struggling a lot more in the DS9 in comparison to the DS4. Now, nonetheless, it does provide for a really nice, serene driving experience. Cabin noise seems to be pretty low. I can't really hear much wind deflecting off the A-pillars, including from the road noise, which is really surprising given that the roads that we're driving on, they're not exactly terrible, but I'm really surprised as to how well insulated this vehicle is. Now, in terms of the maneuverability of this vehicle, it's very easy as well. I'm just going to go left over here, and I just feel it's really easy to maneuver. It feels to respond pretty well. It just feels really good. It feels really nice to drive. It's just that that engine seems to be a bit lackluster, and therefore is a little bit of a hindrance in terms of having that extra bit of grunt that you might expect in a bit more of a premium vehicle of its class. Nonetheless, I think people who are going to be cruising around on the motorway or going around those little inner city commutes will certainly be impressed. Now, I can say that in my short drive, I even had a few looks. I'm not sure if that's because they saw a handsome man with a nice coiffure driving this vehicle, or actually because of the absolute sheer beauty of this car. Very much like the DS4, it looks absolutely sumptuous. I really love what DS have done with the vehicle because it's got that elongated type of profile, a little bit sporty and a bit aggressive, and those lights both at the front and the back look very snazzy. No complaints whatsoever. Now here, given that we are in a bigger vehicle, it's no surprise to learn that there's more space at the rear of the vehicle, and including the boot space, which is absolutely humongous. So therefore, I don't think you'll have any sorts of problems when it comes to fitting larger size goods, or for example suitcases or whatever you might be transporting. Given the class of vehicle, it might be, let's say, golf clubs, or I don't know, something fancy that I can't afford, something like that. But anyway, DS9, very impressive. So what's going to be next in store? Let's find out. So I'm now sat in the DS7, and having just come in from the DS9, I can see how certain things have been translated down to the DS7. In other words, the DS9 is at the top of the range and DS9 just sits below it. Yes, there's still that sort of premium look and feel around the cabin, from the steering wheel, the upholstery work, and the finishes around the dashboard and the door trims, but it doesn't exactly hit that burgundy type of feel of the DS9. Hopefully you guys will agree with me. Now, in terms of the use of technology, there is a fully digitalized instrument cluster, and then there is also a pretty large infotainment system which provides you all the key information that you need, and you've also got Android Auto and Apple CarPlay. It's a larger screen than we saw in the DS4, and therefore makes it a little bit easier to view, let's say, navigation, or for example when you're flicking through certain different settings, such as for example your climate controls, which have been taken digitalized. Now, there's still those little shortcut buttons found just below it, so that makes it quite easy to access the right settings. Now, further down towards the center console, it does actually look pretty snazzy. I think it's somewhat a cross between the DS4 and the DS9, and you can see how this vehicle somewhat sits in between those two. No real complaints other than the little bit of the over-engineered design that I mentioned before. Now, as for storage, it's actually really impressive. The door bins are pretty large, both at the front and the back, and then as for the boot, it's actually humongous. Although the boot opening is slightly odd, to say the least, so that's just worth considering, that when you're going and accessing the boot regularly, you might have to duck a little bit. As someone who's just under 6 foot, it's just something that I did notice. Now, with all of that in mind, let's get on to driving. So just as before, I'm gonna drive a little bit and then give you my impressions. So having driven the DS7 for a short amount of time, I can safely say it's not as refined as the DS9. And by that I mean the suspension system doesn't seem to soak up as many of the anomalies, and the road noise is a lot more present. I can hear and feel the road under me a lot more. But what it really does well in terms of providing me a bit more of that connection with the front axle. There's a bit more of that driver's feel, and to add to that, this is the E-Tense 360 4x4, and therefore dispatches 360 horsepower and 520 newtons meters of torque. Now just to demonstrate that, we're at 20 miles an hour, and if I put my foot down, the vehicle does propel itself forwards really quickly. So yes, it does bring a smile to my face, and the extra power that this vehicle brings and the bit more of a sense of connection with the road under you is certainly appreciated. Now it's got a 14.1 kilowatt hour battery pack, if I'm not mistaken, and therefore is claimed to have roughly 40 miles of range, at least on the WLTP test cycle. So from previous experience, I would say that this sits at roughly 34 to 38 miles, depending on how you drive and where you drive. Now that's of course an improvement over its predecessor, the other DS7, and also some of its siblings. So therefore, in terms of having a bit more of that eco-conscious driving and saving yourself some money, at least if you've got the ability to plug it in, then this vehicle might actually tick that box. So I really do like what DS have done over here with this vehicle. Now aside from this, the manufacturer should be commended with the seamless switch yet again between pure EV power and petrol power. I can't hear or feel it unless of course I initiate a kickdown. The same praise could be said about its 8-speed automatic transmission. Right now I'm in gear 8, and if I were to shift down to 7, 6, 5, 4, you can't hear or feel it. It is absolutely buttery smooth, and I really love that. So therefore it will be very much appreciated for those people doing those longer commutes or indeed cruises. Now apart from all of this, and of course this is going to be very subjective, the exterior design is yet again very snazzy. And here, in comparison to the predecessors of the DS7, the new model actually ups the ante. There might be slightly subtle changes towards the front and the rear, but I particularly like those 3D rear tail lights. They look the part and definitely do stand out in comparison to the alternatives that you can find out there on the market. Now to summarize my initial impressions of the DS7, it's basically a less refined DS9, but one that actually packs a bit more of a punch. Now I appreciate it's available in 4 different powertrains, so you could get it in the same sort of engine spec as the DS9 and the DS4. However, the 360 horsepower that is on tap with this vehicle certainly can be felt. So now I'm going to pull in and switch over to the DS3, and hopefully I'll be able to jump into the fully electric model. So yes indeed, I've managed to bag myself a fully electric DS3, and this is the new model which incorporates a larger 54 kilowatt hour battery pack, and therefore gives it a quoted range of 250 miles on the WLTP cycle, which is certainly impressive. Now aside from that, it also dispatches 115 kilowatts of power, which equates to 155 horsepower. Now in terms of my first impressions of the vehicle, well, it's not exactly as snazzy as the DS7 nor the DS9. The stitching work and the upholstery, while decent, is nowhere near in comparison to its siblings. Equally, in terms of the pop-up head-up display, it's not integrated within the windscreen, therefore not projected in the same sort of way. The instrument cluster, while fully digitalized, just feels a little bit more low res, and it's a lot smaller. Now as for the infotainment system, it sits at a 10.3 inch size, and therefore is a little bit smaller than the ones that we saw in the DS7 and the DS9. No complaints however, as it's got a modern operating system and it looks very snazzy as well. Now just below it you've got these haptic touch buttons, which I'm not too fond of, and it looks a bit like a honeycomb design. No real inherent issues with it, but I just would have preferred physical buttons like we would have seen with some of the other vehicles out there on the market. Now as for the center console, I really love it because it's slightly lower down and it just feels like I've got extra space to play around with. Maybe it's a perception thing, but I just really like what DS have done over here. At the front you've got a wireless charger as well, and it's pretty large for even larger size smartphones, and then further down you've still got this sort of snazzy design with the physical buttons and the gear selector. There's also quite a sizable area within the armrest compartment. Even though it might not seem it, it's quite narrow looking from the outside, but actually within it does actually extend pretty low. Now in terms of storage capacity, you have also got the door bins, and they do seem a little bit limited in comparison to the other vehicles that I've tried so far, and they also have not got any sort of fabric lining, which is a little bit of a shame, so you've got a bit of that hard plastic type of feel to it. Now in terms of the rear occupant space, it's unsurprisingly a little bit more limited. At least specifically here where we're comparing it to the DS4 and the DS9, it's absolutely no match whatsoever. Equally, in terms of its boot, it won't compete. Now, aside from all of this, when it comes to visibility, at the front it's very easy to peer over the bonnet, and yet again I've got that complaint about that rear view mirror. As for the side window and the rear window, they're actually pretty large, although the rear window is a little bit propped up due to the design of the vehicle. But thankfully you've got these really high resolution cameras which give you a full 360-degree view of the vehicle. At least that is what is fitted on this tested press vehicle. Now, with all of that in mind, let me get on to driving, and I'll get back to you after I've driven the DS3 around the country roads and within the city, and give you my own honest opinion as to how this vehicle actually performs. So I'm back, having driven the DS3 for a short amount of time, and what I'll say is that it's not as refined as the DS7 nor the DS9, and it doesn't have the same sort of connection with the front axle, at least in terms of steering input, in comparison to the DS4. However, what I really do love about it is the instant torque delivery. Indeed, is one of the key selling points of fully electric vehicles, because you do not have to wait for an engine or indeed electric motor or battery to kick in. The vehicle just instantly responds to user input, specifically if you're, for example, in the sport mode preset. So I'll demonstrate that very shortly as we approach a 50-mile-an-hour zone. Now, in terms of the electric range, which will be potentially of concern to some people, I can't really comment about it because it's been a short drive and it's been driven by other journalists, and in this respect doesn't give me a real-world experience. But 250 miles is claimed, so therefore I would expect around 210 to 230 miles, which isn't too bad in the grander scheme of things. Of course, bear in mind what are the other vehicles that you can get out there in the market, given the price point of the DS3. Now, as I did approach that 50-mile-an-hour zone, I'm just going to put my foot down to the metal, and you can see indeed I've got that linear torque delivery, and it just picks up instantaneously, whereas the other vehicles I just had to wait a little bit. It wasn't too bad in the grand scheme of things, and yes, I do appreciate the DS3 is also available in different powertrains, including a plug-in hybrid. Now, one thing I don't really like about the DS3, and something I thought I should comment on, at least from reviewing other fully electric vehicles, is that there's only a singular regenerative braking mode, and that is B mode. And while I did like it in the plug-in hybrids, in a fully electric model I would expect some degree of sort of customization via the use of, for example, flappy pedals, or having a mode that would give me one pedal drive. Alas, that's not the case, at least not at the time of filming, and is arguably one of the weakest points of this vehicle. Now, with all of that in mind, as we now pull in to where this vehicle came from, which vehicle would you pick? Do let me know in the comment section below. If I had to pick myself, if I was living around the city, I would probably pick the fully electric DS3. If I was going around longer motorway commutes, I'd pick the DS9. If I wanted something for a bit more of a family size, I'd go for the DS4. And if I wanted something that gave me a little bit more of that excitement while driving, I'd go for the 4x4 360 DS7. So which one would you pick? Let me know down below. Now, if you've liked this independent video and would like to see more, which is of course from myself and of course the channel, definitely do drop a like, subscribe and hit that bell notification, all of which would be greatly appreciated. As such, I've been Chris from TotallyEV, and I'll hopefully see you in the next one. Take care of yourselves and goodbye.